Nous aurons une période de questions après les conférenciers. We shall have a question period after. Our second lecturer, Mark Weitzman, is director of the Task Force Against Hate and chief representative for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. In 2007, he was awarded the National Jewish Book Award for his co-edited volume, Antisemitism, the Generic Hatred, Essay in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal. Mr. Weitzman has also been the US delegate to the ITF for over a decade. Mark?
The remote for the PowerPoint, the remote for the, I don't know. Okay. I'm not Robert, I'm sorry. I'm looking for the remote. While we're doing that, I can't actually begin, but I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers of this conference for putting this conference together, for inviting an international representation to deal with this issue, which cuts across, of course, the question of immigration does cut across border lines, and I'm particularly grateful for the government of Canada for their support on this. If I can add a personal note, I had the opportunity to be in Bucharest a few years ago with Minister Kinney at an OSCE conference on anti-Semitism, where he really took the lead in establishing Canada's new international role in leadership in the fight against anti-Semitism. And I would like to say that it's not just Canadians who are grateful for that leadership, but the international, those of us internationally who fight and work against anti-Semitism and intolerance in general are greatly appreciative of the efforts of Minister Kinney and the government in this regard. So thank you once again. Okay, I don't know where it is.
Do you have it set up?
Well, I'll keep talking because I can do that anyway for a few minutes. As Mr. Kinney has already noted, the St. Louis turned away from the United States, thus symbolizing the fate of most Jews who tried to enter the U.S. during that period. I do think that the broad outlines of the story are really very well known. However, the questions that are raised, the answers that are proposed, and finally the impact of that history today are extremely important to us all. Since my work deals in many ways with the impact of the Holocaust in today's world, and my research has focused on current anti-Semitism and extremism, what I want to do here is to review the historiography of that period, which especially for educators is important to know, and is in itself a story that has a huge impact of our world today, as well as to explore some of today's perceptions on that issue. There is no question that during World War II, and for the first 2 decades after the end of the war, there existed a love affair between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Jewish community. FDR was viewed not only as a leader who had defeated Hitler, but even before that, many saw a special link between the Jewish community and the New Deal, based on the sense that many Jews had that the New Deal was not only the way to economic success, but also reflected the compassion and concern that mirrored their own social principles. Indeed, this idea was not limited to Jews, as in many circles, the New Deal became known, not necessarily positively, as the Jew Deal. And a Jewish Republican congressman of the 1930s once said that the Jews have 3 Welten, 3 worlds: Die Welt, this world; Jene Welt, the next world; and, of course, Roosevelt. This belief was recently summed up by a former Jewish congressman from Brooklyn who wrote that, quote, "As a lifelong Democrat, including having served 9 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, I always revered FDR. His New Deal rescued America from the Depression. His leadership in World War II rescued the world from Nazi conquest." However, that love affair ended dramatically in the 1960s, when a CBS producer, Arthur Morse, published a book, While 6 Million Died, a chronicle of American apathy. The title tells a story. Morse's book was a polemic aimed at overturning the traditional opinion, and as the publisher described it, revealing the untold story behind the deliberate obstruction placed in the way of attempts to save the Jewish people from Hitler's final solution. It sparked a major reassessment. And just to give one example, Stuart Eisenstadt, who was a high-ranking official in the Carter and Clinton administrations, helped create the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, also spearheaded U.S. efforts on Holocaust-related issues such as restitution, payment for slave labor, and recovery of stolen assets, and will be heading the U.S. delegation to the Prague Conference, described how reading While 6 Million Died, quote, told me about the degree to which President Roosevelt and his top aides knew what was happening and refused to act. That had a profound impact on me. Morse's book was followed by the works of David Weitzman, particularly The Abandonment of the Jews. Wyman's book was his second on the subject. His first, Paper Walls, America and the Refugee Crisis, published in 1968, was a look at why America did not fulfill its potential to be a haven for refugees in the period that we are discussing, 1938 to 1941. His conclusion there was that a combination of entrenched anti-Semitism, particularly at the institutional level in the State Department, for example, nativism, and in the insecurities associated with the Depression, all contributed to keeping the refugees out. The abandonment of the Jews magnified and continued the story, dealing especially with the period from 1941 to 1945. Wyman's book became a landmark study that deeply influenced the subsequent view, perhaps even becoming the recognized historical version. In his book, he specified 10 major findings, which you can find up there. The last one was chopped off. I apologize for that. And I'm not going to read them all through. You can read them. The last one is just that U.S. rescue effort, after everything, was still better than any other allied nation. But you see he has a whole list there, and for reasons of time, I won't go through it. While Wyman's narrative has in many ways become the accepted version, other historians have both added to and modified his picture. Richard Brightman and Alan Kraut, in their book American Refugee Policy and European Jewry, while praising the abandonment of the Jews as brilliantly researched, also say that Wyman's moral outrage led him to the verge of inconsistency, that he seemed more concerned with establishing the immorality of behavior than explaining it or assessing its impact. Other historians, such as Henry Feingold in the United States and the Israeli Yehuda Bauer, have modified the narrative, not necessarily by questioning the essential outlines of Wyman uncovered in his meticulous research, but rather by questioning some of the more judgmental aspects of his work. For example, Feingold has written about U.S. anti-Semitism in the 1930s, pointing out that Roosevelt's anti-refugee policy was based on a broad popular consensus that could not be overthrown by any one ethnic group alone, and that came during a period of renewed growth in anti-Semitism in the 1930s. American Jewry lacked the power and ability to build such a coalition. He pointed out that Jews in that period were so traumatized in the United States by the specter of anti-Semitism that the editors of a well-known 1936 Fortune magazine study recommended, quote, the quieting of Jewish apprehensiveness as the very first item in their study. Jews lived, as one contemporary wrote at that time, in a state of fear, anxiety, and constant alarm. This anti-Semitism impacted in different ways. There was the frequent appearance of overt anti-Semitic literature, and this is just a letter that I pulled out of the FDR archives in Hyde Park that talks about the very negative anti-Semitic attitude towards increased immigration of Jews. In other words, an anti-Jewish immigration letter. Or the growth of mass movements like that of Father Charles Coughlin, the Roman Catholic priest, whose radio audience in the 1930s was estimated to be as large as perhaps 30 million people, making him perhaps one of the most listened to people of that period. The anti-Semitism of that period did not exist only in theory. It was a practical anti-Semitism that played out in different areas of American society, such as the university quotas of the 1920s. There were also outbreaks of violent anti-Semitism in cities such as Kansas City, Boston, and New York during World War II. In New York, the surge of incidents from 1941 to 1944 culminated in an official city investigation, while in Boston was the governor of Massachusetts who had to intervene. Anti-Jewish feelings were also pivotal in the area of immigration, as we just pointed out. For example, in 1921, Vice President and soon-to-be President Calvin Coolidge, in a popular article in a women's magazine, described this position, quote, there are racial considerations too grave to be brushed aside for any sentimental reasons. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully. With other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. Quality of mind and body suggests that observance of ethnic law is as great as a necessity to a nation as immigration law. And this was obviously not coming from the fringes of society, but from the inhabitants of the White House itself.